Hello everyone, here we are at week number 6 in Biology 120. Let's see what we've got going on. So last week you learned about DNA, how it was discovered, how it replicates. You learned about mitosis, which is a type of nuclear cell division where you make two daughter cells that look exactly like the mother cell. And transcription and translation, which is the work of DNA to make all the proteins, including all the enzymes that are needed by cells. This week is all about reproduction of cells and therefore organisms. So the chapters for this week are chapters 11, which is on meiosis. That's a type of nuclear division where you get half the number of chromosomes ending up in the daughter cells, and this makes cells like egg and sperm. In chapter 12, you learn all about inheritance patterns. This goes along very well with your lab if you're taking the Bio 120 lab this term. So inheritance patterns including Gregor Mendel and his famous P experiments and dominant recessive traits and sex-linked traits and all sorts of different inheritance patterns are in that chapter 12. And then in chapter 47, you're going to learn some about biodiversity and why it's so important, which we will touch on in just a second. This is toward the end of that textbook, your OpenStax free textbook, Biology 2nd edition. Okay. So those are your 3 chapters for this week. I'm also going to mention another chapter with a section in it to help you answer some of the questions this week. So read the Module 6 overview, watch the videos on meiosis, and especially the one on epigenetics because your discussion board postings are all about epigenetics. Your discussion board postings this week, that initial post is due by Thursday night before midnight, and it is all about epigenetics in this video that you're supposed to watch. So epigenetics is above the genome. I'm going to discuss this in just a minute. In your response post, you're going to discuss whether nature or nurture determines what an organism is. So is it your genes that determine who you are as an organism, or is it in your environment that plays a part in producing you as the organism that you are? I'll get into this in a second too. Your journal entry has a lot of questions to it. It's at least 6 questions that you have to answer, but it may be more than that. Yeah, it may be more than that. So anyway, your journal entry is all about reproduction. How do bacteria reproduce? Now, here's where I'm telling you to go to another part of your textbook. Go to chapter 22, section 2. Go to the bacterial reproduction section. It just says reproduction under that chapter. Find that. Read that couple of paragraphs. That is all you need to know for this journal entry and bacteria and how they reproduce. So how do they reproduce? Through binary fission. If you say mitosis, you are wrong. That is not how bacteria reproduce. It is not anything like they reproduce. Binary fission means split in 2 parts. Binary means 2. Fission means to split. That's how they divide. And what are the advantages of this? And also, how do bacteria get new genetic information? If they just split in half, then that means the daughter cells are always just like the mother cells. So, how do they get new genetic information? Now, this is important. In this section, it tells you how they get new genetic information. Through mutations, that's awfully important. Bacteria are known to mutate their own DNA in order for members of the population to survive. So they throw out hydrogen peroxide into their cells, hoping that someone in the population will survive whatever the stressor is that is present. So mutation, conjugation, that means sharing a plasmid. Plasmid is an extra little piece of circular DNA. Transformation, picking up naked DNA from the environment. And transduction, the transfer of DNA from one cell to another by way of a virus. And yes, viruses infect bacteria. They are called bacteriophages. Some people shorten that to just phage. But that's the ways that bacteria get new genetic information. That is all explained in Chapter 22, Section 2, the reproduction section. Okay? You're going to discuss asexual versus sexual reproduction. What are the advantages and disadvantages of each? I'll touch on sexual reproduction again in just a minute. You're also going to discuss biodiversity and in light of evolution. So you need a definition for evolution. Evolution is a change in genes in a population over time. Now, sometimes this leads to gigantic changes in a species. Sometimes it's just little small changes in a species. It totally depends. And if there are big enough changes in the genes in a species, then you might have a brand new species evolve. So you're going to discuss biodiversity and how this is important and how sexual reproduction in particular is important for the maintenance of biodiversity. And you're going to discuss genetic erosion in agriculture. We are losing species and subspecies of different crop plants, of different livestock, etc. In our farming because we tend to gravitate towards certain species and subspecies that are successful in our region, or in particular for shipping produce and livestock to different locations. We are losing many, many subspecies of these particular plants and animals. Now, one way to prevent this is to save seeds from heirloom varieties. And there's been a really big push in the last few years for especially home gardeners to cultivate heirloom varieties. And you can find whole seed catalogs that are full of heirloom varieties of different crops. So that's part of the discussion too. And finally, so you got discussion board postings, journal entry, and also work on your slides for your final project. You will have this due next week, week 7, but you definitely need to get started on this. You will have milestones 1 and 2 graded by today, later. I'll have milestone 2 graded. So you can start with these and get them into slide format. You're going to use slides like PowerPoint, Google Slides, Canva. I've seen somebody use Canva. I'm not sure what else is out there, but you're making slides with graphics, and then you're including all the information that you have found in the speaker's notes on those slides. And I'll talk more about that next week. Just get started on those slides for that final project. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the material for this week and the information for this week. So genes are little segments of DNA that code for particular traits. That's all a gene is. It usually codes for the production of a particular protein, and this would be an enzyme that helps run a biochemical pathway, and that produces a trait. So genes equal traits. Sometimes a single gene causes a particular trait to show up in human beings. So I have 3 right here for you. So the first one on the left is albinism. There are different types of albinism, and this is a loss of melanin production in your skin. And this can happen in any race, ethnicity, etc. It's just a loss of melanin production. This is a recessive trait. That's what you learn about in Chapter 12. Marfan syndrome is what the fellow in the middle has, and Marfan syndrome makes you especially tall, makes you have big hands, big feet, and so a lot of people nowadays that have Marfan syndrome end up being basketball players because they, of course, are really tall, and they have big hands that can hold basketballs and etc. But they have a lot of back problems, and they have a lot of health problems in general. And another problem that they have is a significant weakness in their aorta, which can burst. And of course, that's the main blood vessel, the main artery that comes out of your heart that feeds the rest of your body with oxygenated blood. And so you can have a rupture of the aorta on the operating table, and doctors couldn't save you from that. So that is a deadly consequence of having Marfan syndrome. And then finally, I have sickle cell anemia. You see a normal red blood cell back there, sort of in the background. It looks like a little Werther's lozenge, sort of. That's the normal shape of a red blood cell. And then you see some sickled cells, because this person with sickle cell anemia is under low oxygen conditions for some reason. They've been exercising. They traveled to a place that has high altitude. I don't know what it is, but anyway, low oxygen conditions cause their red blood cells to sickle out like this. And the problem with this is, you see all the pointy ends? That causes those red blood cells to clog up the capillaries. Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels in the body that are just the width of a single red blood cell. And so these sickled out red blood cells clog up those capillaries and deprive the surrounding tissue from oxygen. And so, of course, that's not a good thing. You can have all kinds of tissue damage if you go into sickle cell anemia, a crisis. And that's a recessive trait. Marfan syndrome is actually a dominant trait. And you learn about that in chapter 12, and you also are doing that in lab if you have lab this term. Okay, so that's genes. Then epigenetics, I wanted to mention this. So epigenetics, and you'll hear this in the video, epi means above, so above genetics. What the heck does that mean? So you've got DNA in all of your cells, and the DNA determines the traits that you have. But here's something to think about. You have all the DNA necessary to make you as a human being in all of your cells that contain DNA. So why do some cells end up looking like nerve cells, and some cells look like liver cells, and some cells look like heart muscle cells, and some cells look like blood cells? Why do you have these differences in the tissues? How can that happen? Because certain genes are turned on and certain genes are turned off to give the instructions to make certain cell types. That's epigenetics, turning on and off genes to do the things that you need them to do, you need that DNA to do in order to produce the cells that you need. This is epigenetics. And if we could understand how to turn on and off genes properly, just think about all the things that we could do. Oh my goodness, it would be so amazing. What did you just learn last week about cancer cells? They don't ever turn off. And so they're constantly dividing. If we understood how to turn genes on and off, we could turn off those genes in cancer cells, and we would never have another case of cancer again in the world. Wouldn't that be wonderful? On the other hand, if we could turn on genes that we wanted to turn on, we could heal any kind of brain injury, spinal injury. We could cause heart muscle tissue to be repaired after a heart attack. There's just so much that we could do. We could make new skin grow. There's just so much that we can do. And so epigenetics is a really fascinating and cutting edge part of genetics right now that is very active in research, because we really need to understand how this works. The turning on and turning off of genes. All right, and then you have that question about nature versus nurture. Nature meaning the genes, nurture meaning the environment. So what is it that makes you you? What is it that makes any organism an organism? Which one is it? Is it the DNA? Is it environmental factors and all the stressors that you're under? Which one is it? Or is it both? Yeah, it's always going to be both. Remember, I taught you that a few weeks back with one of those questions. Is it this, or is it both? Okay, it's always both. But how much does each contribute to making you the organism that you are? we're going to have a discussion about this, and I'm going to put in the announcement section a little film trailer for an old movie called The Bad Seed from 1956. That was a very good year. And it's old and it's kind of silly, but it's got some really, really good points in it. So if you go find this movie and watch it, I tell you, it will be interesting, because there is this discussion in there about how much your genetics forms you and possibly makes you into a psychopathic child, or is it your environment, the nurturing environment that this little girl grows up in? Could that counteract the psychotic genes that she has in her makeup? And that's where the bad seed comes in. It's a little girl named Rhoda, and things happen around Rhoda. So go watch it. It's very interesting. You're going to have this discussion. Which one determines what you are as an organism? Nature, your genes, your DNA. Nurture, your environment. That's always a very interesting discussion. All right, the importance of sexual reproduction. So, like, why in the world, Dr. Sigmon, do you have a picture of the Duggars? Because everybody knows who the Duggars are. And the Duggars have what, like 19 kids? I think this is before they were finished with all that. So they have 19 kids. But the point here is that if you look at the children are all different from each other, but they have the same parents. This shows you the importance of sexual reproduction. The mother, in this case, makes 8 million different combinations of her parents' chromosomes in her egg cells. Old Mr. Duggar there, he makes another 8 million combinations of different chromosomal arrangements from his 2 parents in his spermatozoa. So 8 million times 8 million gives you the chances that you will have an exact copy of a child in this group based on just their eggs and their sperm. Very little chance, right? 8 million times 8 million. That's a gigantic number. This is the importance of sexual reproduction. There's a mixing up of genes so that you get all different offspring, and the hope is, with all organisms that do sexual reproduction, that at least a few of your offspring have the ability to survive any kind of catastrophe, stressor, disease, whatever it is that comes along. You're going to have the ability for somebody to survive in the population, or maybe a whole lot of the offspring to survive in a population, no matter what the stressor is. So the importance of sexual reproduction is that you get a lot of variety in your offspring, and hopefully some of them will survive, no matter what comes along. Okay, and then we have biodiversity and why that's important. And of course it is important. So there's biodiversity in lots of different ways. There's biodiversity in species, and so you got to have lots of different types of genes of each gene. So lots of different alleles is what they're called. Those are varieties of genes in a species in order to keep the species healthy. You've got biodiversity in ecosystems, where you have lots of different species that have their own roles in the ecosystem, that provide food for other species, that consume other species, that do photosynthesis. You've got to have biodiversity in order for an ecosystem to be healthy and to keep going. I would say survive, but an ecosystem doesn't really survive, but just to keep going. When we look at places that are highly developed, like cities like subdivisions, etc. The biodiversity level just plummets because you wipe out all the trees. Even in cities, you wipe out all the grass. You have few insects. You have few mammals. I mean, in New York City, do you have lots of deer roaming around, raccoons, possums? You may have some rats and mice. What about birds? Do you have lots of different species of birds? Do you have owls in New York City? No. Do you have bluebirds? No. Do you have hawks? Probably not. You see where I'm going. You have to have biodiversity in order for ecosystems to be healthy. And this happens through sexual reproduction mainly, but bacteria have genetic diversity too, because of the way that they can pick up new traits. So you're going to have a discussion of biodiversity and why it's so important and how it happens. Okay, with that being said, I hope that you have a great week number 6. We're coming toward the end of the term. We're almost there. So keep up the good work. And if you need anything, let me know. m.sigmon@snhu.edu. Have a good week.